She's a cultural anthropologist whose research interests include education in the Arab world, gender and development, gender and labor, and development in the Arab world more broadly. And her articles and books are listed on your bio page. So, Fida, I give you the floor.
Thank you, thanks. So, as I was just saying to a few folks during the break, I usually teach master's students, and the master's students sometimes think they're above the visuals and the videos, and I've gotten kind of lazy about that myself as a result. And I'm teaching freshmen this year. I'm teaching a freshman seminar that all freshmen take, but it's themed differently depending on who's teaching it. And mine is called Schools, Race Cars, and Politics, Youth in the Arab World. And so I've been trying to jazz it up, but as will be reflected in my presentation, I still got a long way to go. So I thought I'm going to talk kind of about my approach to regional studies as someone who's taught about the Arab world in particular. We're organized, unlike most Middle East studies programs, a little bit more narrowly around the Arab world. And so sometimes I'll say Middle East, sometimes I'll say Arab world. So I want to just talk, I've been teaching in that area for almost 9 years now. And I did a Middle East studies major myself as an undergrad, so just have a long experience with regional studies. So I'm going to talk about approach and then some examples. And I should say I'm an anthropologist too, so a lot of the way I think about the challenges of teaching regional studies is related to my field and kind of ideas about culture. And the problems, the limits of the ways in which we think about culture kind of centers a lot of what I do with my students. So some of the biggest challenges, which you've already heard a lot about it, it's kind of my version of the one story, right? But one of the biggest challenges about teaching about a region as a region is that we imply that there's something shared there, right? The fact that we teach about it as a region applies some kind of cohesion, applies some kind of boundaries that are really somewhat artificial, right? And they're created in particular political moments, and they're often created by external actors who are defining the rest of the world in particular ways. And there's some interesting articles about that, like when did the Middle East come to be the Middle East, that I could share if anyone's interested. Because again, there's a particular kind of geopolitical decision to think about the region in those terms. So the implication then is that the countries in the region form something whole, discrete, homogeneous. And that's often what students come with, when, particularly those with less exposure. Master's students have spent some time in the region and they know a bit more. And then they extrapolate from that everyone in the region is the same, right? Or almost the same, that they're somehow, they share an unchanging, homogeneous culture. Sometimes even the assumption that everyone in the region has the same attitudes, beliefs, mindset. I mean, I hear the word mindset used, Arab mindset, Muslim mindset. And it's also part of the problem is the way in which we see culture, right? Culture as something that others have, culture as something that's bounded, something that's just sort of given to us rather than something we make. And related to this kind of view of culture and view of regions as these discrete wholes, I think, are like ideas about exception, right? That these regions are exceptional and different in particular ways. There's something that makes them similar and different from us. So this kind of exceptionalism. And for the Middle East, this is particularly amplified, right? It's amplified by geopolitics, by the regular coverage of conflict in the region, Islam, Arabs, the Middle East, representations which really reinforce the notion of a shared, unchanging, and deeply problematic culture, right? So this is kind of what I'm working with. And even for extremely bright freshmen, undergraduates at Georgetown University, many of them come with these filters for thinking about the region. So I wanted to talk about, so in my teaching, and this is true for my teaching at all levels, I sort of see it, I have sort of 3 goals and methods that I think about. One is emphasizing change as something constant, and that for me is very much linked to my notion of culture and what I teach about culture. The other is emphasizing the tremendous diversity in the region. And the third point, which I'm trying to do more, starting to is comparison. Is always trying to say, what's unique about this and what's not unique about this. And I try to draw on comparisons, particularly comparisons that are close to home, to say, well, is this so different from this? And I'm going to give some examples. Is this so different from some phenomenon we experience in our own country? So on the emphasizing change as something constant, as I said, it's for me moving beyond a narrow and static view of culture. And part of doing that is just emphasizing a long history of interaction with the globe and the world. Because our ideas about bounded and homogeneous culture kind of assumes isolation, assumes that people's cultures emerge in a space that's somehow separate from the rest of the world, separate from other cultures. And so this can be about talking about trade and centuries of trade, colonialism, military intervention, foreign aid, educational pilgrimages is a term a historian of the Middle East talks about. But around the turn of the century, all the folks from folks from Europe who came to the region to learn about the region and wrote these travel logs about the region, but also local elites leaving the region and going to study in other parts of the world and then bringing those ideas back. In education, you had a whole cadre of people from the Middle East go to Teachers College at Columbia University, from Iran, from Afghanistan, from Iraq. And so when you read the writings of these reformers, they're not a replication of what we have here, but they're very much informed by the fact that they've done their higher education in the United States. So the idea, again, of no community being isolated or bounded. And then the other part of it is kind of just thinking about culture as something that's living, something that is a product of living, a product of human experience, a product of politics, power, economics. It's shared social meaning. I mean, I bring up these definitions and I get us talking about what culture is. Shared social meaning, the ways in which we make sense of the world. And the idea that people are engaged in making that meaning. And as a result, culture is fluid. There are, of course, lots of forces that try to reproduce particular dimensions of our culture. Schools, religion, families, there are things that we try to pass on and reproduce. But culture is a living, breathing, changing thing. And it's impossible to separate it out from politics, economics, history. And so that's one of the key things I'm trying to emphasize in all the themes and all the cases I teach. Again, emphasizing the tremendous diversity in the region. Like the US and everywhere else in the world, right? People's lives are shaped by geography, class, race, politics, gender. And sometimes, maybe I'll just show one example, a quick way I can show them this, and I just found this site, so I'm kind of excited about it. UNDP, and you can click on any one of these indicators, and it'll show you how the countries in the region vary. So if we look at education, we want to look at secondary school enrollment. Just click on it. We see the variety, huge span of secondary schools. So we have countries that have secondary school enrollments that are higher than DC, and then we have some that are down here. And this also is a good segue into, well, these are some of the poorest countries in the region.
That's my country.
Yeah, you're
well, you know, it's funny. They're the official members of the Arab League. I know, so there are these few countries that, and I actually don't know much about those countries, but the UN puts them on there. I work with these up here more, but Yemen's not on here, but if it were, it would be down here somewhere too, because it's one of the poorest countries in the region. But you'll see, for example, Jordan, a country where I've done a lot of research, I'm quite familiar. Secondary school enrollment rates are 83%. And they're slightly higher for females, which is actually true in several countries in the region. Oh, Yemen is here, sorry, I didn't. Yeah, so this is a great way, even in a first class, to say, what do we mean when we say the Arab world? And we could talk about the official designation, right? There are 22 Arab countries that belong to the Arab League. And oftentimes it's just about, is Arabic one of the official languages? And it's also sort of politically where countries align themselves. But you can quickly kind of give them a sense of huge variety of experience just on basic demographics. You have education, gender, health, income, inequality, poverty, sustainability. So these are all just quick kind of visuals. And there are other websites that do this too, that allow you to compare countries in the region to the US or to Europe. And if I have a chance later, I'll bring some of them up. That was where's that PowerPoint?
Sorry.
Okay, so emphasizing the tremendous diversity in the region, and then, and again, I kind of just repeating, while I teach about the Middle East, I always try to reference other examples. So I've heard, we've all talked about how there are these broad themes that, at least at Roosevelt, when we talked the first couple of times, some of the broad themes, and I know I was the one who threw out some of these. But I thought I'd talk about 3 examples today that kind of draw on a number of these themes. So one is women, so I do a lot of teaching about gender and labor. One is women in labor, which draws on the theme of gender and society, economic development, religion, religion, society, migration, travel. I'm actually writing a book right now about the internal migration of university-educated women from small towns in Jordan to the capital for work. And so I'm writing about their own experiences, why they migrate, what their experience is like moving to the capital. Music is another one, and I'm doing a lot on music in my course on Arab youth this semester, and youth and education, 3 examples. So, women in labor. So, one kind of starting point for thinking about this, right, is there's a division of labor. Most societies traditionally have had a division of labor, right? And there are kind of traditional roles for males and females in that division of labor. And in the Middle East, the kind of ideal is a male breadwinner, right? The male breadwinner. Now, I say ideal because in practice, there are lots of female breadwinners, and there are lots of ways in which both men and women contribute to the economic survival and quality of life of a family. But I kind of start by thinking about this breadwinner ideology, or the assumption of this kind of gender division of labor and breadwinner ideology. And I start with the question of, well, where does this come from? And there are a number of kind of ways to answer that question, right? So often when I'm teaching, the assumption is that this is cultural, right? That the culture sort of determines that the woman has to stay at home and the man should go out and work. And I should say this topic comes up a lot, particularly when I'm teaching about international development, because in the Arab world, in the Middle East, you have some of the lowest female labor force participations and rates in the world, formal labor force participation rates, despite quite high levels of education for women, comparatively speaking. So the question of kind of where does it come from? So you can think about and find religious references to the idea, for example, that men should take care of their wives. That is, in a marriage, it's a responsibility for the woman to take care of her home and her children, and it's a responsibility for the man to take care of the financial well-being of the family. And so there's kind of some sources in religious texts. But then it's important to raise the question of, well, what else determines this division of labor? What else sort of shapes decisions about entry into a formal labor force? So then we talk about history and capitalism. I mean, capitalism dramatically changed the way in which work was organized in the region. There's some very interesting work on Egypt, for example, where at a time when you had primarily rural population, subsistence, agriculture, everyone worked. Men, women, and children worked. And when you didn't have such a reliance on a wage economy, ideas about what was work were completely different than the ideas we have today about what work was. So I start always by trying to historicize. So in this particular case of women in labor, I might bring this up. How did kind of new ideas about work, or the reliance on wage-based labor, change ideas about what was valuable work and what wasn't valuable work, and how that disadvantaged women in huge ways, because it created these boundaries around what was work and what wasn't. And so the work that women do, and we know that all women work, regardless of whether they're in the formal labor force or not, was devalued as kind of not work because it was not income generating. And so there are a lot of different ways to approach that. The other thing is to think about, in addition to history, is thinking about the structures and institutional things that determine whether women work or not, whether women enter the formal labor force or not. And there you see quite a number of similarities to the experience of the United States, for example. The availability of affordable childcare, maternity leave, the kinds of jobs that are available. You will find, if we go back to those tables that I was just looking at, the places where women are most likely to be in the labor force are the poorest countries. So in the poorest countries where women have very little choice about going out and helping their families survive economically, the labor force participation rates are much higher. And if you do a good job of counting informal economic work, the labor force participation rates for women are much higher. Once you get to a point where women are relatively educated, you have more low to middle income kind of situation, the choice or decision about work changes, right? It becomes about not an absolute not an absolute necessity for survival to go out and make a living, but kind of an opportunity cost, right? And that's where these structures of childcare, maternity leave, the hours you're expected to work, really shapes the decision of men and women about the division of labor and who should go out to work and how to divide those responsibilities in a household. As a result, you find that in addition to the fact that I just said that the highest rates of labor force participation are in the poorest countries, the women most likely to work in the region beside that category are single university educated women. So single university educated women in a country like Jordan, which has an overall labor force participation rate of only 15% for women, is 60% for single women with university education. And that's because they can find decent jobs, and it's also because they haven't yet had to address this situation of what does it mean to be a working woman with children, right? Am I going to be able to balance the two? And so what you see often is a drop-off rate once women get married, or a switch from private sector jobs where their hours are much longer to teaching in the public sector, because that allows for a greater ability to balance between home and work. Now these are all issues that in the United States have been a long part of our history and continue to be, right? Every year we have an op-ed about why do so many women leave the workforce when they have children, and is this a lost economic benefit? Is it wasted investment? And then you have these people who say, how dare you imply that raising my children is wasted time? I mean, this happens in the New York Times almost annually, right? So for some women, middle class or aspiring to be middle class in the Middle East, very same kinds of issues, like regardless of kind of particular religious history or regardless of even that kind of history of capitalism, colonialism, many of them are facing very similar questions to the questions we face today. So to show that, I pull up things like an op-ed that recently was in the New York Times a few years ago that essentially said this, that we're wasting our money investing in women to get MBAs in Harvard or law degrees, that they're just going to sit at home and raise their children. And then I show the students the letters that responded to that article. The other thing I often show is the New York Times had in their magazine a cover page and it had a picture of pants, and it said, who wears the pants in the family? And this was kind of in response to the economic crisis in the US, right? Lots of unemployment amongst men. And this journalist was kind of trying to track what happens in a family when a man loses his job and a woman enters the workforce, and she has always been at home. How does this sort of challenge his idea of male breadwinner? And so these are just interesting examples for us to think about what's similar and what's different, right? What's similar and what's different. In terms of music, I find music is a great opportunity to talk about any number of issues. I just had a student in my office who wants to do a research paper about music, and we talked about it. And one of the first things she said to me is like, well, what is the relationship between Islam and music? And so we had this discussion. So it's an opportunity to talk about religion and how ideas about being a proper Muslim are varied and change over time. I talked to her about the fact that in my research, there were folks who I would consider more kind of fundamentalist. In what sense? More literal readings of their religious texts, and these are relatively new movements who, as a result of kind of the way in which they're reading Islamic teachings, have decided that most forms of music are sinful and harmful. But as I said to my student, there are Baptists in this country that think that music is harmful and sinful. I mean, so there are varieties of ways in which being a Muslim can be experienced, shapes our lives, and music is an interesting way to see that. Because on the one hand, while you have some scholars or individuals in the region who think that most forms of music, or certain forms of music, are kind of against Islam, you have a long and rich history and musical tradition in the region. And this also enables us to talk about kind of music and nationalism, the ways in which music was mobilized in anti-colonial movements, the ways in which music is mobilized by authoritarian countries to promote patriotism. In my book on girls' education in Jordan, I wrote a whole chapter about patriotism. And a big part of that chapter was about these musical performances that kids had to participate in. And Jordan is an authoritarian regime light, right? I mean, we think of it as moderate authoritarianism, but it's quite authoritarian in the sense that the king's pictures everywhere, you can't criticize the government. Not only can you not criticize the government, you can't criticize allies of the government, you can't, etc., etc. So there's very limited free speech. And at the school, kids would be brought together for these patriotic events. It was the king's birthday, actually. It was 10 years ago I was doing research. And it was actually 2 months after his birthday, and I said, why are you guys still celebrating the king's birthday? And everyone was like, shh, don't ask. And then he actually subsequently, a few years later, said he didn't want any official celebration of his birthday. But at the time, they would have these performances, and music was a big part of it, having kids come out, and these were girls. It was a girls' high school, perform in these patriotic events where they would kind of sing and dance for the nation. So there are ways in which music can be mobilized by the state. But it's also, music is also about opposition and agency, right? So it's an opportunity to teach about youth culture and moral panic, right? Think about the ways in which music and new forms of music have caused moral panic in this country. Whether it was Elvis shaking his hips, Marilyn Manson, promoting devil worship, rap music, whatever the new forms of music and youth cultures are always seen as dangerous, right? As pushing some boundary or crossing some boundary. And you have something quite similar in the region as well. I think about one particular example. One example is there's kind of, for example, rap. There's a lot written about rap in the Middle East because there are young people who kind of embrace rap as a form and are using it as kind of a political tool. And there's a great movie called Slingshot Hip Hop, I think it's called. It's about Palestinian rap and hip hop groups. And what's interesting is this one researcher has written this great book about rap and hip hop in Palestine, is the ways in which it raises kind of debates about authenticity. So on the one hand, for the outside, it's rappers kind of talking about Palestinian issues and Palestinian national struggle. But inside, there are debates about, is this really authentic music? And should we really be rapping if we're trying to preserve our tradition and fight for our nation? Like, we should draw on indigenous forms. So it's a way of thinking about how local people struggle over this question of authenticity, but also kind of what is the goal of this music? Who are these young people trying to reach out to? And then how they get policed because of the messages that they're conveying. The other example is this Lebanese group, which has gotten really popular in Lebanon and outside, called Mashroua Layla, and which is like a Knights project or something. And Mashroua Layla kind of pushes the envelope on things like love. They have kind of like, they imply a homosexual relationship between the singer and he talks about a relationship, and there's an interesting thing. Traditionally, in Arab music, male singers would always use the masculine when they were using love songs. And that was because it was considered kind of like shameful to sing to a woman, right? Historically speaking. So this guy in the song is singing to a man, but he's really singing to a man. So he's using this device. And the only reason we know that is because he's kind of out in a way that has become known, and so then makes the song controversial in a way in which it might not have been had we not known, had we not seen videos and interviews with him. So Mashroua Layla performed in Jordan in Amman a few years ago. And then Mashroua Layla was supposed to perform again this past summer, and they were banned. And the objection was actually raised by the Greek Orthodox Church in Jordan. So some representative of the church objected to them coming to sing in Jordan. They canceled their performance. This created a huge uproar in Jordan outside, and then they rescinded the cancellation and invited them back. But by this point, they were singing at the Fillmore in Silver Spring, and so they didn't go to Amman, and I missed it, unfortunately. But so I'd like to I'm bringing in like different articles about this controversy and saying kind of what questions about morality and authenticity are being raised by this group. What is this group trying to do? Are they really oriented just to the outside, or are they also oriented to the inside? Let me just give you a quick look at, they've got a great one here that's just about marriage and class, and he's singing a song about, what is that? No, those are just the lyrics. Remember when you told me that you would marry me without money or a house? So he's going on and on about this woman who's promised to marry him and then doesn't because of his economic status. But I want to actually show you a clip of the. Where did I go? Dementia. Why does this close every time I leave it? All right, the video is.
Click on the food that fights dementia.
You want to know about that?
It's there. Scroll down a little bit.
Scroll down.
Scroll down. Scroll down.
You're looking for the.
Okay, stop.
Yeah,
There it is. Just to give you a little glimpse of where they have it.
YouTube.
I don't know if it'll.
I think the sound on the computer's
Oh. So it's already on.
On the computer, on the here.
So you have to go, yeah, minimize.
I turned it off because I didn't want that volume on mine. That's my fault.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
So he's forlorn, you know, because he's not going to get married. Sitting there in the wedding sconce bus. The car's being towed. I just want to go to the... He's cutting up, oh, there's the girl. There's the cake. That's the he's flashing back to the preparations. And that's him. Anyway, just to give you a sense. I mean, here he's singing about a woman. This is not the song where he's explicitly singing about a male partner. He's singing about a woman. And the themes are really about, in this one, are really about economics. And what's interesting is there's a classic song from almost, like a folk song from almost 50, 60 years ago that sings about the same exact themes. It sings about this theme of, you know, I love you, but I can't have you because you live up here and I live down here. And actually, they talk about because you live, you know, in the mountains and I live down in the valley, and you're used to walking on feathers. So this theme of kind of socioeconomics and how it shapes marriage opportunities. So again, to go back to, I'm kind of jumping all over, but I take the kind of question of music and what do people, and I think about music and religion, music and class, I think about music and nationalism, and then I kind of just try to draw on different examples. So I haven't been as good about bringing in examples for you here, but the youth and moral panics, and the last one is youth, is an opportunity to teach about agency and political opposition. 5 minutes, okay. So here we have a region where there's, you know, widespread authoritarianism, very little space for kind of any kind of official political participation. But despite that, you have a history of people fighting back and trying to push the boundaries, and music has been one way in which people have done that, even on some of the worst kind of authoritarian contexts. The Syrian bear, I'll just read the description of it. Every time I click on something, it makes me lose my flow here. But the Syrian bear is this group that emerged when the Syrian conflict began, and if a bear wanted to sing one day, then the lion must be quiet. The Syrian's president's name means lion. The Syrian bear is an endangered species, and we as Syrian bears believe it's necessary for new animals to enter the political scene, etc., etc. So they do very political music, and I doubt they're in Syria anymore, and they never reveal their faces in the music because it's quite a dangerous situation. But there's all kinds of music that have emerged in this kind of Arab Spring, Arab revolutions moment too, in Egypt and Syria. So a lot, and there's a long history of this. I mean, Egypt has a very long history of kind of political music. And I could share examples of kind of different examples of these different categories with anyone via email if that's something you're interested in. But since I'm almost running out of time, let me try to wrap up with my last example is youth and education. So there's a perception about the region, right? Often when you read anything about youth in the region, you hear youth bulge, youth bomb, you know, the ticking time bomb. And a lot of the literature we read here and the media coverage talks about, you know, huge numbers of youth, educated but not educated enough, and that this is creating great instability. And so this is if we take this other kind of theme, right? So the first one's women in labor, second one's music. Think about youth and education. Again, I'd sort of start by saying, well, is there youth an education crisis? And I would look at some demographics and think about it, go back, you know, well, what are the actual levels of education? And again, you know, just the other day in NPR, I'm hearing about how these graduation rates in DC have gone up to 60. So we have huge struggles in our own country, right? And we have such variety in our own country and such inequality in our own country. And that's true in any part of the world. And so I bring those together when I can. And I also talk about the history of education. Oftentimes we, and our young people, right, have a very short historical span. I mean, how long has it been in the world in which people actually felt like mass education was something we should have? You know, the Brits for decades debated whether working class people should be educated and what they should be educated for. And they took those ideas with them when they colonized other countries. So that's really interesting sometimes just to show them that, what British officials were saying about working class youth in England and what they were saying about youth in Egypt or youth in Iraq or youth in Iran, because they were very wary of educating the masses. So the idea that mass access to education for everyone is a relatively new idea, right? It's only been with us for a century or two, and we're still struggling to kind of meet that goal. So I talk about colonial education policies, I talk about the relative newness of mass education, and then I sort of say, okay, what does public education look like in the region? And we talk about different forms, we talk about private versus public education. The second question is kind of what are the major fault lines in terms of education in the region? And again, here the comparisons are clear, right? The major fault lines are socioeconomic and they're geographic. Gender is no longer kind of the primary difference. The primary difference is socioeconomics and geography. Rural, poor kids are less likely to be in school, period, regardless of where you are. And quality of education also depends on your class. And so while we have high secondary rates in a country like Jordan, less than half of those kids are passing the exam they need to get into university. And that's a quality issue, which is very much based on class. And then again, how do sort of the educational trajectories compare to other places? And here are just some links I'll share later, but that both kind of map youthfulness in the world and in the Arab world, but then also some educational stats. UNESCO has a great easy database. You can click on any country and it'll give you basic educational stats for any country you're interested in. And one thing I'm going to do with my class this year when we talk about education is there was this great BBC documentary done about youth and education in Syria before the war, and it takes kind of really different glimpses and it interviews like this female Syrian rapper, this girl who's running track, this Iraqi refugee who's going to school in Syria, and so it's got 5 kind of short videos about the experiences of different youth in Syria. And then we've got this article about this massive crisis in Syria today and how a whole generation is not being educated as a result of that. So I'll leave it at that and see if there are any questions or comments. Thank you.
Your experience in the Middle East, when the Arab Spring broke out in 2011, we actually had a panel at my high school. Lansing Freeman organized it, a teacher who since moved on. We had 4 or 5 speakers. One was Blair Perrin, who was a New York Times reporter. One was a Middle East expert, I forget where he was from, but your funny video about that gentleman whose fiancé rejected him for not having a job. I mean, one of the speakers' whole thesis is of all these problems that are in that region right now. And you look at other similarities where people say things like, conflicts that are occurring now, some are driven by climate change, resource scarcity, things like that. One of the speakers' thesis was, this is not my belief necessarily, but his was, what's driving this whole upheaval, at least 5 years ago, is these huge numbers of young men who don't see an economic future, and you can't get married, a conservative Muslim male, prohibitions on premarital sex, things like that. So he says you have this region that is so economically challenge that you have this large generation of young men who marriage is not a prospect. Do you see any kind of validity to that looking back over 5 years? And I thought that was a very interesting comment. And all the kids were like, at the basic fundamental bottom of this are some really just basic human issues and problems of marriage and family and things like that.
Yeah, I've actually done some research on marriage too. I interviewed 50 single men and women. It was very fun research, I must say. I felt like a marriage counselor by the end of it. And I have an article coming out about love in times of crisis, in times of marriage crisis. But I'll say a few things about that. And I actually just last week talked about the relationship between poverty, unemployment, and conflict in class. And there's really mixed evidence about this. There's this great report that Mercy Corps, this international global development organization, just did, essentially arguing, they did it last year, and they did it based on research they did with youth in their programs in Afghanistan, Somalia, and Colombia. And they say that poverty and unemployment are not the biggest predictor, but a sense of injustice is the biggest predictor. But this is still related to what you're saying, because unemployment may come with that sense of injustice, right? So if you feel like you're unemployed because there's corruption in your country, because other people are excluding you, it's got to be the combination of those things, right?
The Tunisian fruit vendor, the way.
Yeah, exactly, sense of injustice. And in that case, it also involved police harassment. In the Egyptian case, too, it was a case of police brutality that first brought people out in the street. They were memorializing this man who had been killed by the police. So this sense that there's some authority that has no accountability, and So I thought the Mercy Corps stuff spoke to me a lot more than some of the stuff I've seen about kind of instability and unemployment, because it was saying it's not just unemployment, it's got to be kind of a perception that somehow you're being excluded, that there's corruption, or that you're being kind of attacked from the outside, that this is what drives young people to engage in political violence, really. And also you have to think about these countries. Political violence is an alternative easily at hand, right? And sometimes the only alternative for trying to fight for change, or the only one that young people can see. My other kind of theory, and it's just a theory, is that in the Arab world, it's also about kind of expectations that have been created, right? As a result of kind of post-World War II, state-led development, young people were there was a lot of upward mobility. I mean, the Arab world has had like tremendous success in providing education to its citizens. I mean, in some countries, in less than 5 or 6 decades, you've gone from a handful of schools to 80% secondary school enrollment. I mean, it's a dramatic, in terms of access, dramatic change and dramatic progress in terms of providing access to formal education for people in a time frame that's much shorter than many other parts in the world. But that education created expectations, and there was a time in which governments could promise employment, could promise generous social welfare programs, and with increasing debt, structural adjustment, a whole host of things, the cost of oil, the price of oil, because even though many of the countries in the region are not oil wealthy, they were able to send their educated young men mostly to go work in these wealthy countries, and those remittances, so there's kind of a regional way in which oil benefited everyone. A country like Jordan benefited hugely from the ability of their young, skilled people to go work in the Gulf. So I think it is about, I mean, it's about unmet expectations, and it's really kind of people who thought they could be middle class, right, and aspire to be middle class and feel like they can't be. I feel like a lot of the grievances come from there, but I also think they're really political grievances too, and I don't want to ever make it all about economics. These are authoritarian regimes that are very repressive, and when people feel like there's, and again, the poorest don't have the luxury of fighting that usually, right, because they're just trying to survive day to day. So while you might have bread riots and that kind of thing, organized protest often comes from the folks who have their daily needs met but want more. And I think that's what drove a lot of, and there's a lot of history of these kind of movements against the regimes, but they've been suppressed, and there was just, sometimes you don't know what combination of factors let it happen. I mean, there was definitely a domino effect. I never expected people to go out and protest in Syria because it's one of the most oppressive regimes in the region. I thought, oh my God, the courage to just go out, but they thought it happened in Syria and Tunisia, we could do it. And so it started out as peaceful protests, and now it's, yeah.
I find that with my students, when trying to talk about sort of the diversity in Islam, the beauty of Islam, the different forms of Islam, etc., students really get fixated on talking about oppression. Mm-hmm. And so, how do you balance discussing the oppressive nature of some of these countries, and yet celebrate the identity of the people? And
yeah,
it's quite a medley there. So since you brought it up, could you address it?
Yeah, I mean, it is real. I mean, I try to bring it back to the people, right? In the sense that these are regimes, these are, elites, and these are also, I mean, that's even a simplification in and of itself, but I try to talk about what people want is what most people want. They want their families to live well, they want to be loved, they want their kids to succeed and have a better life than they had. And, and sometimes they want basic freedoms, right? But they have to weigh that against all these other things too. I mean, one of the problems with the reality of authoritarianism in the region is there's a lot of representation of people in the region as people who don't want democracy, right? That this fits their culture, authoritarianism. But we have a long history, and this is another way of showing it, of people resisting authoritarianism, whether it was colonial, whether it was Turkish, whether it was, whether it's sort of contemporary forms of colonialism or imperialism or authoritarianism. It's a long history of people fighting back against that, so that's one way of kind of just fighting against this narrative that this is what people want in the region, right? That this just fits their culture or fits their... And the other way, I mean, it's hard because sometimes I do weigh on the side of things are pretty bleak in the region, but it's just that there are lots of wonderful things happening. So sometimes it's highlighting these amazing initiatives that young people are engaged in the region, or the work I've done. Actually, most of the work I write about is quite positive. Like the book I'm writing right now is about women who come from, not poverty, but relatively modest backgrounds, who succeeded at school, who finished university, who are migrating to the capital, sometimes supporting younger brothers and sisters to go to college, sometimes, supporting elderly parents. And this is in a context where people assume they're oppressed. Not only us outside assume they're oppressed, their own countrymen assume they're oppressed, country women, their fellow citizens who live in the capital assume because they're village girls and they're small town girls that they're oppressed. And that's a lot of the barrier that they face when they come to the capital. So there's definitely a sense, so at least in terms of gender, I'm constantly writing about amazing women who of course face challenges, but do have done remarkable things with their lives. And not remarkable in the sense of becoming minister, but remarkable in the sense of helping my younger siblings go to college, or remarkable in the sense of, leaving my country for 2 years so I could help support my widowed mother. And the other thing I like to emphasize too is they have the support of their families. Because part of the way in which we represent women is somehow they're constantly fighting their culture and their family. And the only way that women are doing this is with the support of their family. I mean, these women are not doing this alone. So when I teach about gender a lot, and that's one of the key ways in which I do it, is talk about the variety experience, try to de-villainize families, because I feel like they're villainized, that there's this oppressive Arab Muslim family, and talk about the ways in which families want very much what any family wants, right? And sometimes that's making sure that the daughter marries well, because if you're poor and you've worked hard your whole life, you hope your daughter won't have to work. And sometimes it's to have a career. It kind of depends on your particular history. And on the politics, I feel like the Arab Spring provides this beautiful example of the resilience of despite kind of what has come out, of the resilience of human beings, of the role of arts and culture, so I use a lot of that too. Yeah. Sorry.